So I threw her down the steps.
Mr. Little had a very keen memory. It was almost photographic. He never took trophies. His trophy was up here in his mind.
Samuel Little, the man who confessed to an utterly shocking 93 murders between 1970 and 2005. With such a staggering body count, Little may be the most prolific serial killer in American history. On the surface, Little seemed like an average transient drifting across the country. But beneath his facade lurked a stone-cold predator who spent decades hunting vulnerable women to satisfy his twisted desires. Now, through exhaustive investigations and Little's own chilling confessions, the sheer scale of his sadistic 35-year killing spree is finally coming to light. How Little was able to carry out so many brutal murders in so many places without ever getting caught. We'll look at his transient lifestyle and how he targeted victims living on the margins of society.
Did you ever shoot any of these girls?
Shoot.
Yeah, with a gun?
My hands.
Just your
And
hands?
without that, I wouldn't want to do it.
And we'll examine the horrific confessions that ultimately expose just how much blood was on his hands. Let's start at the beginning. Samuel Little was born in 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia, though he was raised primarily by his grandmother in Ohio. Little claims he suffered abuse as a child that warped his psyche. As a teenager, he began having violent sexual fantasies about strangling women. Disturbing urges he acted out on animals. These early warning signs pointed to the sinister path ahead. In his 20s, Little began drifting around the United States, racking up arrests for crimes like theft, fraud, armed robbery, and rape across multiple states. But then in the early 1970s, his inner demons fully emerged, and his offenses took a deadly turn. Little started crisscrossing the country, unleashing his sick desires upon vulnerable women in a sprawling, decades-long murder spree. Little's first known victim was Mary Brosley, found strangled in Miami, Florida in 1971. But the transient killer quickly disappeared. Over the next 35 years, nudie and battered female bodies started turning up in alleyways and canals across at least 19 states. But with no clear connections between cases, the murders went unsolved, allowing the elusive Little to keep killing again and again. Part of what allowed Little to evade justice for so long was his lifestyle. He was constantly on the move, a drifter hunting the most marginalized victims, like prostitutes, addicts, and homeless women, who often went unnoticed in life and unmourned in death. Places like Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, Ohio, California, and more became Little's sinister hunting grounds. By his own twisted account, he claimed many lives during his coast-to-coast murder spree. Let's examine some of his most chilling confessions. In 1982, Little admitted to meeting an attractive 30-something black woman at a nightclub in New Orleans, Louisiana.
She was pretty, a light-skinned, brown, honey-colored skin. And she was about 5, she was about tall, she was tall for a woman.
He lured her into his vehicle and drove her out to a canal off Interstate 10. There, he strangled the life out of her before dumping her body, which was never found. The city was just one of many stops on his murder tour. A few years later in 1984, Little picked up a 25-year-old white female hitchhiker outside a strip club in Covington, Kentucky.
North Little Rock. Tell me what that girl looked like.
Oh man, I loved her. I forget her name. Oh wait, I think it was Ruth.
Okay.
She was a heavy-set, big old yellow gal, and had buck teeth. It had a gap between the teeth. That's what it was.
He strangled her inside his car before leaving her nude body atop a rural hillside, where she again disappeared without a trace. But Little's deadly spree started even earlier. Around 1971 or 1972 in Miami, Florida, he crossed paths with an 18-year-old transgender black woman named Marianne at a local bar. He drove her out to the Everglades under the pretense of taking her home. There, along an isolated dirt road, he murdered her and dragged her into the swamp, once more leaving no evidence behind. Through the 1980s and the 1990s, Little simply continued his sadistic pattern coast to coast, virtually unimpeded. He would blow into a new town, settle into the local transient community, scout a vulnerable new victim, satisfy his twisted desires, and move on before anyone suspected a thing. For instance, in 1993, Little met a 40-year-old black female on a Las Vegas, Nevada street and took her back to his motel.
Las Vegas. Describe the Las Vegas victim.
That was in '93.
Okay.
I bought a Eldorado.
What color Eldorado?
It was a yellow.
Okay.
Oh.
Yellow Cadillac Eldorado.
Yep.
All right. What year?
78.
Okay. Well, tell me about this girl. What does she look like?
She was kind of thin, dark skinned, about 40 years old when she was out there hustling. I think she was a drug addict because she wouldn't have been out there.
How tall was she?
She was about 5'5", 5'3".
There, he strangled her to death before stuffing her body into his car trunk and dumping her down a remote embankment, likely never to be found. And from 1992 to 1994, Little killed a 24-year-old black woman in Little Rock, Arkansas, discarding her naked body in a rural cornfield.
She was pretty, a light-skinned, brown, honey-colored skin. And she was she was tall for a woman.
Just one of many lives he took before slipping away again. Little lurked on the fringes, carrying out his evil rituals, believing he could operate with impunity. But in 2012, his luck finally ran out. Little was arrested in Kentucky and extradited to California to face drug charges. And there, advanced forensics would finally tie him to unsolved murders across the country. DNA evidence definitively linked Little to 3 brutally beaten and strangled women found naked in Los Angeles alleyways in the late 1980s. Their bodies showed they endured unspeakable suffering, the work of a violently sadistic killer. In 2014, Little went on trial for these killings. Prosecutors effectively painted him as a calculating predator of vulnerable women. Convicted on all 3 murder counts, it seemed Little would die in jail, case closed. But the nightmare was far from over. In 2018, Little stunned the nation when he casually confessed to dozens more murders in exchange for a prison transfer. Investigators quickly realized this was no ruse. It was a shockingly depraved killer openly confronting his gruesome legacy. A dedicated FBI task force began working urgently to verify Little's accounts of slaying marginalized women across 19 states over 35 horrific years. The horrific details soon emerged. Little admitted to specifically hunting and strangling vulnerable targets like addicts and prostitutes, often just using his bare hands to satisfy his twisted desires. He could describe victims' appearances and murder locations in chilling detail. By late 2018, the feds had definitively tied Little to 34 cold case slayings through DNA evidence and his twisted confessions. Among his many victims were mothers, daughters, sisters, cases that had gone unsolved for decades. For still grieving families, Little's confessions finally provided answers, but reopened wounds, long thought scarred over. Investigators continue working to confirm over 50 more cold cases based on his statements. Given the number of slain, marginalized women across the time frame of his offending, experts believe Little's victim count likely exceeds 100, a staggering toll that may make him the worst serial murderer in U.S. history. So how did this seemingly unremarkable drifter get away with so much murder? By living completely off the grid and targeting victims on the fringes who often went unnoticed, Little was able to hide in plain sight for over 35 nightmarish years. For communities shattered by his violence, Little's confessions have brought some closure, along with renewed grief and shock at the scale of one man's inhumanity. While the full extent of his evil may never be quantified, families can take comfort in knowing the truth has finally emerged from the darkness that long shrouded his crimes. However painful, names and voices have been restored to Little's forgotten victims. Survivors have been given some semblance of peace. In the end, Little thought nobody could ever trace the sprawling trail of horror he left across nearly 2 decades and 20 states. But he was wrong. Through advancements in forensics and revelations from his own twisted mind, justice has finally prevailed over the secrets this monster kept for so long. So what do you all make of Little's bone-chilling confessions and his staggering body count? How did one seemingly ordinary man perpetrate such open brutality for so long? Share your insights below. Until every cold case is solved, the search for clues goes on. Join us next time on Crime Clues as we dissect horrific cases to uncover critical evidence hidden in plain sight.